1981, four aspiring rock musicians from California boarded a private jet, vanishing mid-air without a single distress signal. Their aircraft slipped off radar screens and was never found. Until nearly 2 decades later, for 19 long years, their disappearance remained one of the great unsolved mysteries in aviation and music history. Then, a U.S. Navy deep-sea exploration team made a discovery on the ocean floor, one that would unravel a chilling secret hidden in darkness, waiting to be uncovered. On a calm, sunlit afternoon in Crescent Harbor, rays of light gently streamed through the sheer lace curtains of Helen Hayes' modest sitting room. The sunlight danced across the worn fabric of her favorite armchair and the open pages of her novel. At 63, Helen had discovered solace in life's quieter moments. Her glasses perched gently on her nose as she lost herself in the comforting repetition of a book she'd read a dozen times. The small, salt-kissed town along Northern California's coast had served as her sanctuary for nearly 20 years. Ever since that heart-wrenching afternoon in 1981, when her son, a passionate 20-year-old vocalist from the band Crimson Fireline, disappeared mid-flight with his bandmates. Just as Helen turned a page, the sharp ring of the kitchen phone pierced the stillness, jerking her from her thoughts. "Hello?" she answered, her tone polite yet cautious, expecting the usual, perhaps a solicitor or another wrong number. Instead, a man's voice crackled through the receiver, professional and clipped. "Mrs. Hayes, this is Lieutenant Commander Jackson with the U.S. Navy. I'm here with the Crescent Harbor Police Department concerning your son Zane Hayes." Her breath seized in her chest. After 19 years, she'd trained herself not to anticipate such calls. She clutched the edge of the kitchen counter, her knuckles pale with tension. What is this about?" she managed, her voice brittle. "Ma'am," the officer continued, "we've recovered what we strongly believe to be the private jet that carried your son and his band the day they disappeared. We're requesting your presence at Port Holston Naval Base." The words struck her like a thunderclap. Helen leaned heavily against the counter, her world momentarily spinning. "I don't have time for hoaxes," she snapped. "That plane went down almost 2 decades ago. My son is dead. I've made peace with that." Before he could answer, she slammed the phone down, her hands trembling. The grief she had meticulously packed away now threatened to burst free like a tidal wave. The pain wasn't just Zane's loss. Shortly after his disappearance, her husband Malcolm had suffered a mental breakdown. He was institutionalized for several years, declared mentally stable later, but never fully returned to the man she once knew. After his release, he retreated into solitude, his spirit dulled, his presence in their community reduced to whispers and shadows. Helen lowered herself back into her chair, but the words on the page refused to align. The book that had always brought her peace now felt foreign in her hands. When the phone rang again, 4, 5, 6 times, she ignored it, trying to will it silent. But it rang a 7th time, then an 8th. "I already said," she began, her voice sharp, but this time a woman's calm, clear tone interrupted her. "Mrs. Hayes, please, don't hang up. My name is Special Agent Dana Truitt with the FBI. I understand this must be shocking, but the Navy's report is real. The plane has been found. We need you to come to the base." Helen's vision blurred with unshed tears. Her voice cracked. "I'm sorry. I didn't think this would ever happen again." "We understand," Agent Truitt replied gently. "Do you need assistance with transportation?" "No," Helen whispered. "I'll manage." She hung up and moved with robotic resolve. She dressed in a simple navy blue dress, choosing comfort and modesty over form. Her shoes were soft, well-worn. As she stepped out of her front door, the weight of the years bore down upon her shoulders. A familiar car coasted to a stop beside her. The windows slid down, revealing the lined, weather-beaten faces of Patricia and Donald Maddox. "Helen," Patricia said, her voice thick with unshed tears, "are you going to Port Holston?" Helen nodded silently, her throat too tight for words. She recognized them instantly. Their son had played bass in Crimson Fireline. "Come with us," Donald offered, opening the rear door. She slid in, grateful. As they drove, Patricia turned to her. "The Kleins are on their way too. Derek's aunt and uncle. His parents passed 2 years ago. And the Marinos? Ricky's cousins are coming. His mom and dad both passed from old age." The silence in the car was thick. punctuated only by the occasional sniffle or the shuffle of tissues. Nobody spoke much. What words could possibly prepare them? The ride was long and somber, punctuated only by the occasional sniffle or the murmured rustle of tissues. Helen stared at the ocean, the coastline a blur of blue and gray. When they finally pulled up to Port Holston Naval Base, they were greeted by a heavy military presence. Sailors, FBI officials, local law enforcement, forensic experts, and what looked to be marine researchers were stationed across the grounds. Agent Truitt was waiting at the gate, her FBI badge glinting under the sun. She was younger than Helen expected, but her expression held a gravitas that exceeded her years. "Thank you for coming," she said sincerely. "I understand this is a lot to take in. Please, follow me." Helen's breath hitched as they were led toward a cordoned-off section of the base. Resting in a massive, tarp-lined pit was a sight she had never imagined seeing again: the private jet from her husband's old photographs. Back in 1981, Malcolm had taken pictures with their analog film camera, preserving what he'd called the band's shooting star moment. Those photos had been submitted as evidence, later stored in a dusty file. How the plane sat before her, like a relic pulled from the void. The fuselage was streaked with rust. Seaweed clung to its frame like mourning veils. The once vibrant red striping had faded to a grim shade of brown. The windows were shattered inward, as if something, or someone, had tried to get out. A man stepped forward, dressed in a lab coat. "I am Dr. Martinez, head of the NOAA Marine Research Team," he began. "We were conducting a routine deep-sea ecological survey when our sonar picked up a set of metallic anomalies. Our submersible deployed a camera and, to our astonishment, it revealed an intact aircraft, at a depth of nearly 12,000 feet. He gestured toward the jet. "With the assistance of the Navy and FBI, we used a specialized marine crane from our vessel to retrieve the wreckage. Remarkably, the structure was preserved. The doors remained sealed. The fuselage was largely undisturbed." Helen could hardly take her eyes off the aircraft. Though covered in salt corrosion and streaks of algae, it still bore the unmistakable features she remembered from the day her son waved goodbye. The curvature of the wings, the red-striped tail now dulled to a muddy rust color. Each detail reawakened memories she had buried beneath decades of sorrow. The team of scientists began their technical explanations, discussing pressurization patterns, signs of external stress, and the unusual state of the cabin's interior. But Helen barely heard them. Her thoughts were with Zane, frozen forever at 20, and the unimaginable truth that might lie inside that plane. The aircraft's body lay in eerie stillness, cradled in a net of tarps under portable floodlights, its sea-weathered fuselage glinting beneath a layer of brine. Dr. Martinez stood beside it, speaking quietly with Agent Truitt as investigators scoured the wreckage. "For something that's been submerged for nearly 2 decades, it's astonishing how intact the structure remains," he observed. "Low temperatures, low oxygen, minimal current. It created something close to a natural deep-sea preservation chamber." Helen stood in silent awe, her eyes drifting toward several dark body bags that had been placed with careful reverence beside the fuselage. Her stomach tightened. "Are those—" she murmured. Agent Truitt gave a solemn nod. "Yes, that's why we asked you to come." Dr. Martinez joined them. "We believe the conditions of the crash site slowed decomposition enough that visual identification might still be possible. The odds are rare, but not impossible." Patricia Maddox stepped forward with a trembling hand, gripping her husband's forearm for support. "Please," she whispered, "let us see them." The forensic team exchanged looks and then gave a quiet nod. With slow precision, one technician kneeled beside the first body bag and gently unzipped it. A strangled wail tore through the air. "Trent!" Patricia collapsed to her knees, sobbing uncontrollably. Even after 19 years, the flamboyant red leopard pants were unmistakable. Her son Trent Maddox, the exuberant bassist of Crimson Fireline, had always stood out for his wild sense of style. That same choice now confirmed his identity. Another bag was unsealed, and inside lay a body in a cracked leather vest, his metal-studded belt buckle gleaming faintly under the work lights. Derek Klain. His aunt and uncle gasped, breaking into muffled sobs. The man inside was undeniably their nephew, the rhythm guitarist who had once dreamed of selling out stadiums. The next 2 bags did not reveal the flight crew. Instead, they held unfamiliar men in deteriorated yet expensive clothing. Tailored suits, faded silk ties, shoes that had once been handcrafted but now appeared fossilized. "These aren't crew," Martinez noted. "They were likely passengers, wealthy judging by the apparel and accessories." Helen stepped closer, her voice a whisper. "My son said they were meeting a major European label, some global distributor or producer. Malcolm, my husband, handled their deals, but he rarely told me specifics." Officer Rodriguez, who had led the case back in 1981, stepped forward. "We confirmed that. Malcolm Hayes reported all known details at the time, but after the disappearance, he unraveled emotionally, became violent. He was diagnosed with acute psychological stress and institutionalized. He was released 5 years later but never recovered socially. We reached out to him when the plane was recovered," Rodriguez added, "but he wouldn't come. Still lives in isolation, no phone, no visitors." A forensic tech suddenly called over. "Agent Truitt, you need to see this." She crossed the lot and bent over the monitor, then stiffened. Turning back to the families, her face darkened. "There are bullet wounds," she said flatly. "Gunshots, all of them." "What?" Patricia whispered, her grief momentarily frozen in shock. Dr. Martinez stepped in. "Clean entry wounds on every body recovered. There are no injuries consistent with high-impact trauma, which suggests these people were shot before the crash." "So this wasn't just an accident?" Donald Maddox asked quietly. Agent Truitt's expression hardened. "No, this is no longer a disappearance. It's now a homicide investigation." "And the pilot?" Helen asked, dread settling in her stomach. "Gone," said Truitt. "No trace in the wreckage. Flight controls suggest the autopilot was engaged. Our theory is he bailed, parachuted, possibly orchestrated the entire thing." Helen's hands shook. "But Zane and Ricky? They weren't in the wreckage?" "No," Truitt confirmed. "Their bodies weren't recovered. We don't know what that means yet. They could have escaped or been taken elsewhere." Helen clung to the fragile thread of possibility. "Maybe they survived. Maybe they got out." "It's not impossible," Truitt said gently. "We're opening an international investigation to find out." As word spread, press vans arrived in a swarm, lights flicked on, microphones were extended into faces that barely had time to process what they'd seen. Reporters angled for sound bites. A young anchorwoman began a live feed with the wreckage behind her. "Breaking news today from Port Holston Naval Base, where the long-lost aircraft carrying members of the rock band Crimson Fire Line has finally been recovered. Evidence suggests foul play." Each family was pulled aside for brief interviews. When it was Helen's turn, she faced the cameras with composure built from years of pain. Her voice was soft but steady. "I believed my son was gone forever," she said. "Now I'm not so sure. We have answers, yes, but we also have more questions. Zane, if you're seeing this, if you're out there, please come home." The interviews ended. A young officer offered Helen a ride. As the car pulled away, she looked back at the plane, no longer lost but now a monument to tragedy. 19 years it had slept in darkness, hiding the truth. Now its silence was broken, its story beginning to speak. The drive home was quiet. The officer didn't speak, sensing Helen's need for stillness. He helped her to the porch and gave a courteous nod. "If you need anything, ma'am, we're here." "Thank you," she replied softly. Only when the patrol car disappeared did she enter her house. Closing the door behind her, she leaned against it and finally broke. The sobs tore from her throat, raw and deep, as she slid to the floor. Her navy dress bunched around her legs as nearly 2 decades of sorrow poured out into the emptiness of her hallway. Eventually she composed herself. Standing slowly, she moved to her small office. Her old desktop computer still hummed, a relic from another time. She logged into a forum she hadn't visited in years, a support group for families of the missing. Her hands trembled on the keyboard. She typed, "They found the plane. 2 of the boys were inside. They were shot. My Zane wasn't one of them." Replies came quickly. messages of love, hope, and prayer, and warnings. One post read, "Helen, protect your heart. After all these years, don't let hope destroy you." Hours passed unnoticed. Then she glanced at the clock and was startled. Her doctor's appointment was in less than an hour, and the bus would take 30 minutes. She also wanted to see Malcolm. He deserved to know, no matter how far apart they drifted. She snatched her purse and hurried outside. Her legs ached as she rushed toward the bus stop. Just as she arrived, the bus pulled away. She waved desperately, calling out, but the driver didn't see her. She stopped, breathless, her chest rising and falling as she watched the bus disappear. Rather than wait helplessly, Helen turned and began walking toward the next bus stop. The air was cooler now, the late afternoon breeze stirring her hair as the reality of the day settled in. Her thoughts drifted in and out of focus. Trent's pants, Derek's buckle, the unnamed men in suits, Zane's absence. She clung to that absence like a life raft. In a day filled with horror, that one mystery still held the flicker of possibility. Her shoes clacked softly on the pavement. Cars passed without notice. Nobody recognized her now. Not as the woman from the news or the mother of a vanished rock star. She was just another aging woman walking a lonely sidewalk with heavy thoughts and a shattered heart. But for the first time in nearly 20 years, beneath the grief and fear, she felt something stir. And not certainly. Not peace, but something fragile and real. The beginning of hope. Helen checked the posted schedule again, confirming that the next bus wouldn't arrive for another 40 minutes. She sighed and leaned back against the plexiglass wall of the shelter, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows along the pavement. A figure stood at the opposite end of the shelter, near the edge of the sidewalk. A man, maybe in his early 50s, clad in a faded denim jacket and scuffed jeans. He kept his distance, but stared at her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. Trying to dissolve the unease that had settled in her chest, Helen forced a polite smile. "Nice day," she said, her voice quiet but friendly. The man didn't return the smile. Instead, his eyes remained cold and expressionless. "Saw you on the news this morning," he said flatly. "Your kid. Thought he'd be dead by now. Probably still rotting in a trench somewhere." The word struck her like a slap. Helen recoiled, instinctively clutching her purse closer. "What's your problem?" she snapped, more out of fear than anger. Another bus pulled up to the curb, hissing as its brakes engaged. Not hers. The man said nothing more. He boarded slowly, casting one last look at her through the window before disappearing inside. His stare didn't waver, his face unreadable, but tinged with menace. Helen stood frozen, her heartbeat racing in her ears. "Some people are just cruel," she muttered under her breath, trying to calm herself. "They don't understand." She checked her watch. Still 30 minutes until her ride. Restless and uneasy, she decided to walk the few blocks to the local supermarket. There was a payphone outside, one she had used in years past, when she didn't want certain calls traced back to her home. Calling Malcolm now felt more urgent than ever. He needed to know what was happening, whether he wanted to or not. The supermarket was bustling with weekend shoppers. Carts clattered over linoleum floors, children tugged at candy displays, and elderly couples perused the produce. Helen made her way past the automatic doors and to the phone booth near the side entrance. She picked up the receiver and punched in Malcolm's number, one of the few she still remembered by heart. He answered after 4 rings, his voice distant and skeptical. Helen took a deep breath and told him everything about the plane, the bodies, and the fact that Zane wasn't among them. Mitch nodded. "And the fact that he wasn't among them." Malcolm's initial reaction was cold denial. "It doesn't change anything," he said. "It's just a crash. Old wreckage dredged up to poke at dead wounds." "It's more than that," Helen insisted. "Zane might still be out there. I need you to listen. Please." A long pause followed. Then, quietly, he said, "What do you want from me?" "I want you to meet me. Today, after my appointment, 3 o'clock. "I'll think about it." "It's not something to think about, Malcolm," she said, her voice firmer than she expected. "Be there." She hung up the phone and turned to leave, and stopped cold. The man from the bus shelter stood directly behind her, close enough to touch. Helen gasped. "What?" he snapped, as if her fear was an inconvenience. She said nothing. Her pulse pounding, she turned and walked briskly back toward the store, her shoes clacking loudly against the pavement. She glanced behind her. The man had picked up the payphone receiver, but wasn't speaking. He was watching her walk away. Something was wrong, deeply wrong. This wasn't just a series of coincidences. He wasn't a stranger anymore. He was following her. Her pace quickened. The once familiar streets of Crescent Harbor no longer felt safe. She needed crowds, witnesses, somewhere to disappear into. Helen pushed through the supermarket's entrance, her breathing shallow. The cacophony of beeping scanners and squeaking cartwheels offered a fragile sense of safety. Inside, it felt like the world had returned to normal. Through the window near the front entrance, Helen noticed a closer bus stop, just beyond the parking lot. Closer than returning to her original stop. She noted the location and decided to wait there instead, once she'd collected herself. Trying to steady her nerves, she wandered deeper into the store. The produce section was full and colorful, a familiar comfort. The rows of apples, tomatoes, and oranges glistened under fluorescent lights. She often found solace in routine shopping trips. They grounded her when the world felt chaotic. She spotted the escalator leading to the second floor and, without fully thinking, ascended. Malcolm used to love browsing the upstairs magazine racks, especially for old issues of National Geographic. Even in the fractured state he lived in now, those glossy nature spreads seemed to calm him. Perhaps she'd find something to bring him. As she stepped off the escalator, she found herself in the electronics section. A wall of televisions lined the back wall, 20 screens, each showing the same footage. Her own face stared back at her, a frozen image from earlier that day. The broadcast replayed her statement to the press, her plea to Zane. The anchor's voice narrated over images of the ocean-soaked plain, of men in uniform, of families standing together in stunned silence. Helen Hayes, mother of lead singer Zane Hayes, made an emotional statement earlier today following the Navy's discovery of the long-missing aircraft. Helen was transfixed. It felt surreal, like seeing a ghost of herself caught on loop. "Oh my God, that's you, isn't it?" said a voice beside her. Helen turned to see a woman in her 30s holding a shopping basket. Her eyes were wide with recognition. "You're the mother from the news." Before Helen could answer, more people gathered. An older man laid a gentle hand on her shoulder. "I'm so sorry for your loss, dear. My nephew loved Crimson Fireline. Billy used to play at Mickey's Bar," another shopper said. "Every Thursday night. My sister went just to see your son perform." Voices layered upon each other. Memories, condolences, questions. A tight ring of strangers began to form around her. Helen's chest tightened. Her breath became shallow. She tried to step back, but the crowd pressed closer. "Please," she managed, "I just need some space." The voices quieted slightly, but the circle remained. Then a commanding voice cut through the noise. "Give the lady some room." Helen looked up, expecting to see a store employee. Instead, her blood turned to ice. The man from the bus stop stood at the edge of the crowd, his eyes locked on hers. He stepped forward and, before she could react, gripped her wrist. "What are you doing?" she gasped, trying to pull away. He didn't respond. His grip was strong, cold, and mechanical. He guided her away from the televisions, past stunned onlookers, and toward a maintenance corridor. The crowd didn't follow. No one stopped him. The emergency stairwell door was slightly ajar, a faded sign reading, "Authorized personnel only." He pushed it open and forced her inside. The stairwell was dim, its cement walls echoing every footstep. Helen yanked her hand free. "Why are you following me?" she demanded, her back against the wall. He didn't smile. His expression was hard, unreadable. "I'm not your savior," he said. "I'm just here to deliver a message." He stepped closer. Helen froze as she felt something cold and metallic press against her stomach. She glanced down. A gun. "If you say anything at all, to the police, the FBI, anyone," he hissed, "you can kiss your son's future goodbye. You talk, and it's the end of everything." Helen's voice broke. "Please, if you know where Zane is, if he's alive, please." His eyes narrowed. "You talk, you die. And the man I work for, he doesn't forgive." He leaned in, his mouth close to her ear. Better to drown yourself in that ocean than cross him. Helen's mind raced. How do I know you're not bluffing? That you even knew my son? The man paused, then whispered, The lighthouse keeper's daughter waits by the shore, counting stars that fell. Helen's breath caught. Those words weren't public. They were lyrics. Lyrics Zane had written in a notebook he kept beside his bed. A song never released, never performed, just something he'd once read aloud to her in his room one night. Her blood ran cold. He knew. Helen's world tilted, and the breath caught in her throat. The line he'd spoken, about the lighthouse keeper's daughter waiting by the shore, wasn't something anyone else could have known. Zane had never shared it with the world. He had played it just once, late one night, perched on the edge of her couch with his acoustic guitar in his lap. His voice had been soft, barely more than a whisper, as he strummed the delicate melody and recited the unfinished lyrics. He hadn't even written them down, saying he was still working on it. Only she had heard them. Only she was meant to. Now, that secret had been dragged into the light by a man who seemed to know far too much. "We know everything," the man said coolly. "Your appointments are every other Thursday, the Tuesday grocery runs, the drive you take to Sunset Hills once a month to see your husband. We've been watching you for years." Helen's voice cracked. "My son, he's really alive?" The man didn't answer directly. He took a slow step back, hand casually resting on the weapon beneath his coat. "Keep your mouth shut," he said, voice now low and menacing. "We'll talk again. But if you're reckless, if you breathe a single word to anyone, police, FBI, press, I won't hesitate. Bad things will happen. To you and to your boy." With that, he turned and descended the stairwell. His footsteps echoed hollowly, each one pulling him further into darkness. Helen remained rooted to the spot, her body trembling, her thoughts racing like wildfire. Then her legs gave way. She collapsed against the wall, tears coursing down her face, breath shallow and ragged. Her heart pounded so hard it felt as though it might break free of her chest. The man's threat had shattered the fragile illusion of safety she'd built over the years. Suddenly, the emergency door creaked open. A young employee stepped inside, his expression morphing from surprise to concern when he saw her. "Ma'am? Are you all right? You shouldn't be back here. Do you need help?" Helen struggled to her feet, brushing tears away with the back of her hand. "No," she lied. "I just needed a minute." Recognition dawned in his eyes. "Wait. You're the woman from the news, right? About the band?" She nodded weakly. "I'm really sorry about your son," he added gently. "Thank you." Helen squeezed past him, her mind already spinning with the weight of what she'd learned. She had completely forgotten about the National Geographic magazine she'd come to buy for Malcolm. It didn't matter anymore. Only one thing did: getting out of there. She descended the escalator quickly, clinging to the handrail as though it might tether her to reality. The supermarket doors seemed far away, and she rushed toward them just in time to see her bus turning the corner onto the street outside. She ran, waving both hands desperately. The driver, a kind-faced older man with a gentle demeanor, spotted her in the mirror and paused. "Take your time, dear," he said, reopening the doors. Helen stumbled inside, still shaking. "Thank you," she whispered. She slid into a seat near the front and stared out the window as the bus rumbled forward. The supermarket faded behind her. She scanned the street, searching for any trace of the man, but he was gone. Still his words lingered. "They've been watching for years. Zane's alive, but not free." Her thoughts spun endlessly. What kind of life had her son been living? Had he been hiding or imprisoned? Who were these people? What did they want? And why now? The bus eventually pulled up to the hospital. Helen disembarked slowly, her legs still trembling from adrenaline and fear. She walked the familiar tiled hallway, checked in at reception, and sat through the usual routines: blood pressure, weight, and quick chat with Dr. Peterson. "Your heart's stable, Helen," the doctor said, scanning her chart. "But you really need to manage your stress levels." She nodded numbly, not even hearing him. Her mind was far away, filled with half-formed questions and ominous possibilities. Outside, The sky had begun to darken, the sun dipping toward the horizon. Helen stepped back onto the sidewalk, prescription bag in hand, and made her way to the bus stop. Then, a low honk broke her reverie. Across the street, a dark sedan was idling. The man was in the driver's seat. He gestured curtly for her to come over. Fear spiked in Helen's chest. She turned toward the hospital doors, thinking of the safety inside, the cameras and the security staff. But then the man's voice echoed in her mind. "If you say anything, bad things will happen. To you, to your boy." Slowly, reluctantly, she crossed the street. The man rolled down the window. "Back seat," he said coldly. "I don't even know who you are," she said, voice trembling. "Get in, now." With a surge of dread, Helen obeyed. The door clicked shut behind her. Instantly the locks engaged. She was trapped. "I know you were going to see your husband," the man said, staring back into traffic, "but that can't happen." "I wasn't going to say anything," she pleaded. "I just wanted to tell him about the plane." He shook his head. "Doesn't matter. You talk, even to him, and it all comes crashing down." He reached over the seat and tossed a pair of metal handcuffs onto her lap. Helen stared at them in disbelief. "What the hell is this?" "You're testing my patience." She tried to back away, but in one swift movement he twisted around, seized her wrists, and snapped the cuffs on tight. "Make a sound, and I'll kill you right here," he growled. The words drained the air from her lungs. She sat frozen as he resumed driving, one hand on the wheel, the other casually resting near his weapon. They drove for what felt like hours. Crescent Harbor gave way to dense woods and twisting back roads. Finally, he turned down a dirt path that led into a thick forest. A small cabin came into view. Weathered wood, sagging porch, boarded windows. It was isolated, surrounded by trees and silence. He parked and yanked her from the back seat, dragging her toward the door. Inside, the cabin smelled of mildew and stale smoke. There was a fireplace, cold and dusty. A single chair. No phone. No signal. "You can't do this," Helen whispered. "I already am," he said. He pulled a roll of black duct tape from a drawer and slapped it over her mouth. Her muffled protests echoed off the cabin's bare walls. Then he stepped outside, lighting a cigarette and pulling out his phone. Through the window, Helen saw him pacing, speaking into the receiver. When he noticed her watching, he moved deeper into the trees, out of sight and out of earshot. Helen struggled against the handcuffs. They were tight, metal digging into her wrists. Her arthritic fingers were useless against them. Panic bloomed in her chest. She was alone, and no one knew where she was. Somewhere beyond those trees, the man was still speaking, reporting to someone, confirming her capture, maybe even planning her next move. But Helen's thoughts clung to a single truth like a lifeline. Zane was alive. Whatever had become of him, whatever forces now controlled their fates, she had touched something real. And she would not let go of that hope. Not now, not ever. Helen sat slumped in the chair, wrists raw from the handcuffs, her chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. She was 63 years old, her heart frail, her body weary from years of quiet grief and solitude. Now she was a captive, held by a man who had invoked the name of her son Zane. A man she hadn't seen in nearly 2 decades. Her mind reeled with fear and disbelief. The door creaked and Edric returned, crushing his cigarette under his heel. His footsteps were calm, practiced. Without saying a word, he moved to the far wall of the cabin and pressed against what appeared to be an ordinary panel. A subtle click sounded. The panel swung open, revealing a hidden compartment built seamlessly into the wooden wall. From it, Edric withdrew several small plastic-wrapped bundles. Each one was tightly compressed, uniform in size. Helen didn't need to ask. She knew exactly what they were. He turned and walked back to her. The air was thick with menace. He ripped the duct tape from her mouth in one swift motion. She gasped, the sudden intake of air dry and painful. "What is that?" she whispered, though she already knew. "You need to swallow these," he said coolly, setting the packages on the table beside her. "No," Helen said, her voice rising with panic. "Those are drugs. I won't. Kill me if you must, but I won't do this." Edric remained still, watching her. "Why are you doing this to me?" she cried. "I'm just a grieving old woman. I'll die soon anyway. Isn't that enough?" He stepped forward. "My name is Edric Kenvo. I have business with your son, and if you ever want to see him again, you'll do exactly what I say." Helen's breath caught in her throat. She didn't respond. "Please," she finally said, her voice cracking. "I have a heart condition. This could kill me. If there's any humanity left in you—" But he drew his gun and pressed the cold barrel to her temple. "I'm not a good man," he said. "You swallow these packages or I pull this trigger. 3 seconds." Helen flinched, her entire body trembling. "1," Edric began. "2." With a hand that shook violently, Helen picked up one of the packages. It was cold, dense, and coated in a thin layer of grease to aid in swallowing. She placed it on her tongue, choking slightly as she forced it down. Another followed, and another, 4 in total. "Good," Edric said. He holstered his weapon and produced a pill bottle. "Take these. They'll coat your stomach and keep the packages intact." She took the pills without water, tears streaming down her cheeks. The bitterness scraped her throat like sandpaper. "Don't ask questions," he said, his tone flat. "It's better for everyone, especially you, if you don't know too much. You're not going to die. You're just transportation." He recuffed her wrists and lashed her to the chair again with coarse rope. "Someone will come for you soon. Stay quiet, and you might see your boy." Alone again, Helen sat motionless, the chemical weight in her stomach sitting like lead. A numbness began to spread through her limbs, not pain, not yet, but a growing fog. The pills were kicking in. The world began to tilt, her vision blurred at the edges, the walls of the cabin swimming. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat seeming louder than the last. She couldn't tell if the fog in her mind was the medication, or panic, or the contents of the packages themselves. Time lost meaning. She might have slept. She might have fainted. At some point, headlights cut through the gaps in the cabin's boards. An engine rumbled just outside. The door opened. "Time to go." Edric's voice echoed from far away. His face appeared warped in her haze, like a reflection on water. She felt his hands unlocking the cuffs, untying the rope. Her legs were jelly beneath her as he pulled her to her feet. She staggered toward the door, the cold night air slapping her face, bringing a fleeting clarity. A truck waited outside, large, covered. 2 men stood by it, dark-haired, speaking rapid Spanish. They didn't look at her like a person, just cargo. One grabbed her by the arm and shoved her toward the vehicle. "Inside, weacha," he muttered. The truck's rear opened to reveal not just crates and tarp, but a second hidden compartment. One of the men pressed on the interior panel, and it creaked open. Darkness spilled out. "Get in. Stay quiet." Inside, Helen ducked, her blurred eyes slowly adjusted to the shadows. At first, she saw only outlines. Then faces. Women. All young, pressed against the walls in silence. Some looked barely out of high school. All of them had the same look. Vacant. Hollow-eyed. Broken. Helen was the only one older than 30. The only one older than 50? She felt ancient in that dark space. Ancient and irrelevant. The realization hit her, even through the drug-induced fog. This wasn't just about drugs. Protection. It was trafficking. The panel sealed behind her, cloaking them in complete darkness. The truck engine roared, the vehicle lurched, and they began to move. No one spoke. No one cried. It was as if they had all learned that silence was safer. Helen found a corner and sank down, her knees pulled to her chest, her back pressed against the cold metal wall. She didn't cry, not because she wasn't afraid, but because the moment called for something colder, something harder. She was in a machine now, one that processed people like raw goods, and she was part of it. Time vanished. The truck stopped now and again. Voices would murmur, doors would open, but not the one to their secret space. Eventually, the drugs wore off. Helen's mind cleared, and with it came the weight of full realization. She was being smuggled across borders on a human freight, with drugs inside her, surrounded by enslaved girls. The horror was as complete as it was inescapable. At last, the truck stopped for good. New voices, deeper, rougher, men speaking in guttural English and what sounded like Russian. The secret panel swung open, blinding light flooding in. They squinted, shielding their eyes. A massive figure stood at the opening. "Out! All of you, move!" They stumbled into what appeared to be a warehouse. Concrete floor, towering rafters, the smell of oil and chemicals thick in the air. Armed men surrounded them. All had Slavic features. All wore scowls like they'd been carved from ice. The women were herded into a side room. Adjacent to it stood another smaller room with a glowing radiation symbol above the door. A low mechanical hum came from inside. Helen's heart fluttered with dread. One by one the girls were called inside, and each time the hum of the machine grew louder, more ominous. An X-ray machine. They were being scanned for contraband, for drugs hidden inside their bodies. When Helen's name was called, a man shoved her forward. The metal door opened. Inside, the walls gleamed with cold steel. The air smelled like ozone and bleach. A second man entered, this one half shrouded in shadow. As he stepped into the light, Helen's breath caught. The left side of his face was grotesquely deformed, crushed, scarred. One eye drooped permanently downward in a grotesque sneer. "Press against the wall," he ordered. Helen complied, her bones aching. The X-ray machine began to hum. She closed her eyes, praying to survive this one more hour. The man with the disfigured face returned, carrying a dented metal tray lined with tiny plastic cups, each filled with a cloudy, bitter-smelling liquid. His uneven gait echoed off the warehouse walls as he barked a single command. "Drink!" The younger women reacted without hesitation. With the resigned discipline of soldiers, they lifted the cups and swallowed their contents without flinching. Helen hesitated, her hand trembling violently as she reached for hers. The liquid inside swirled like poison, its scent alone strong enough to make her gag. The man noticed her hesitation immediately, his dark, sunken eyes narrowed with contempt. "Why did they send us an old woman?" he muttered to his companion in broken English. "She can barely stand. 4 packages. Is a joke?" asked the boss. The other man replied flatly. Helen tried not to meet his eyes, but the disfigured guard leaned in, his rancid breath hot against her face. "Drink, babushka," he sneered. "Or I make you drink." With no choice, Helen lifted the cup to her lips. The liquid burned as it went down, sour and thick, like drinking death itself. Her insides clenched, and she cursed herself for ever trusting Edric. She should have let him pull the trigger in that cabin. At least it would have been quick. Now she was trapped in something far worse, a slow, calculated march toward destruction. "I take the old woman to Bruno," the man announced. "He decides. Maybe we can send a message to the supplier next time. No more garbage like this." Helen didn't resist as he seized her arm. His grip was a vice, fingers like steel clamps digging into her flesh. She winced as pain shot through her shoulder. Around them, the other women said nothing. Their faces were vacant, hollowed out from whatever horrors they had seen. She was alone in every way that mattered. "Move!" the man barked. Helen stumbled as he dragged her forward, her feet slipping on the stained concrete floor. They exited the chamber and entered a series of corridors that grew progressively darker and colder. The overhead lights buzzed and flickered, some dying altogether. The deeper they went, the more the warehouse morphed into something subterranean, like a bunker built for inhuman secrets. At last, they stopped before a rusted black door. Its paint was peeling in jagged flakes like diseased skin. The guard shoved it open, revealing a narrow staircase spiraling down into blackness. Helen shivered as the cold rose from below, creeping up her legs. "Go," the man grunted. She descended step by shaky step, her breath catching with each creak of the iron stairs. At the bottom stood another door. The man kicked it open and thrust her through it. The room on the other side hit her senses like a hammer. Red walls, red floors. At first, she thought it was paint. Then the smell hit her. Rotting meat. Urine. Feces. The scent of death. Helen staggered, retching, but the gag kept her from vomiting. In the center of the room, 3 women knelt in a row, blindfolded, gagged, and bound. They trembled but didn't speak. A man stood with his back to them, arm raised, a pistol aimed at the head of the first woman. "Gerald," the broken-faced man called. "Where is Bruno? I'm an old woman. Supplier sends USA mole?" The man turned. Helen's vision tilted. Despite the setting, despite the impossible circumstances, she recognized him at once. Ricky Moreno, her son's friend, lead guitarist for Crimson Fireline. His baby face had hardened slightly, but the eyes were unmistakable. Recognition flashed across his face, followed by fear. "I think you are—" Helen began, her voice trembling. Ricky cut her off sharply. "Get me a gag. Blindfold. Zip ties." The guard obeyed, and Ricky worked quickly. The gag came first, then the blindfold, then the zip ties. His hands were steady, practiced. Nothing like the awkward teen who'd once serenaded her family with his guitar in their garage. "I'll take her to Bruno," Ricky said. "Let him decide." He pressed his pistol into the guard's hand. "You finish with these three." Helen's knees buckled. Behind the blindfold, she heard it, the pleasure in the man's voice. "Duh, I finish." Ricky's grip was firm but not rough as he pulled her away. As they climbed back up the stairs, shots rang out. 1, 2, 3. Execution. Helen sobbed behind the gag. The screams built in her throat, but she couldn't escape. Ricky never flinched. He led her through more corridors. Their steps echoed through the silence. Eventually he stopped, opening a door and guiding her inside. The air changed. It was warmer, cleaner. Her an office. She was pushed down into a cushioned chair. The door shut. The locks turned. Then her hands were at her face. The gag was removed, the ties were cut, and finally the blindfold lifted. Fluorescent light stung her eyes. And there he was. Zane, her son. Older, with longer hair streaked in silver. His pale skin had lost its glow, but not its identity. The full lips, the serious eyes, the gentleness beneath the exhaustion. Helen gasped. "Zane," she whispered, "is that really you?" He nodded, tears in his eyes. He knelt before her and took her hands, pressing them to his face. "I'm so sorry, Mom." She turned to Ricky. You're Ricky, aren't you?" "Edric? He said you were alive." Ricky scoffed. "That man is as bad as the rest of them. You think this is salvation? This is the pit." Helen looked around. The desk bore a plaque that read, "Manager." Zane reached out, cupping her face. "I never meant for you to get pulled into this. I tried to disappear to protect you." "I don't care," Helen said. "I've found you. That's all that matters." A tear slid down Zane's cheek. Helen wanted to hold him forever, to bury her face in his shoulder and weep for all the lost years. But behind her joy was an ocean of questions crashing against the shore of her mind. "What happened to you?" she whispered. "All this time. Why didn't you come home?" Zane's eyes darkened. "I couldn't. Not after what I saw. What we were forced into." He stood and began to pace the office, running his fingers through his graying hair. "That flight, it was never about a record deal. We were bait. Someone powerful used our rising fame as a front for something else. When the jet went down, it wasn't an accident. It was a controlled disappearance." Helen stared at him, horrified. "You mean?" "Yes," Ricky said, stepping forward. "We were taken. All 4 of us survived the crash. But the people waiting on that island didn't care about music. They cared about obedience." Zane nodded. "They made us choose. Join them or die." Helen clutched the chair's armrest. "The others, Trent, Derek—" "They didn't make it," Ricky said flatly. "They refused. So they were executed. Just like those women today." Helen looked between them, her voice cracking. "And you stayed?" "I survived," Zane whispered, "because I had to, for the chance, one day, to get out, to find you." Helen's hands trembled. "And now?" Ricky glanced at the door. "Now things are changing. The operation's grown. Different factions are fighting for control. That's why Edric brought you. Your leverage." "Leverage for what?" Zane didn't answer. Instead, he walked over and knelt again before her. "But I promise you this, Mom. I will get you out, no matter what it costs." Helen shook her head, tears streaming freely now. "We go together. I didn't come this far to lose you again." In the distance, a door slammed, footsteps approached. The moment of peace was over. But the fire between them had been rekindled. Hope, once drowned beneath years of sorrow, now burned fiercely in both their hearts. They would survive this. Helen's stomach turned to lead, her pulse quickening as she stared at her son and Ricky. "What is this? Are you both working for these monsters?" "There's no time to explain," Zane said urgently, his voice hard-edged. "And no one can know we're related, do you understand?" Before she could answer, chaos erupted outside the office. Voices shouted in Russian and English, overlapping in a violent crescendo. Gunfire cracked short, sharp bursts, followed by screams that ended too abruptly. Ricky moved instantly, slamming the deadbolt on the office door, his movements practiced and quick. Zane lunged for a filing cabinet, yanked open a drawer, and retrieved 2 handguns, tossing one to Ricky. Helen's gaze shot to the desk. A landline phone sat in plain sight. "There's a phone. We can call the police," she exclaimed. "They'll come for us. We can escape this place and go back to our lives." "No," Zane snapped, cutting her off with uncharacteristic force. "This is our life now, Mom." "What are you talking about?" she demanded, stepping forward. "It doesn't have to be this way." Zane blocked her path, his body stiff, eyes hard and unfamiliar. "Edric's men are taking over. He promised me we'd be reunited if I joined his side. He's keeping that promise now. He'll protect us." "This isn't protection," Helen cried, reaching for the phone. "It's madness. You're not a criminal. You're my son. You're a survivor, a victim of that plane crash." Zane's expression darkened. "Sometimes the line between victim and criminal blurs. We've had to do terrible things just to stay alive." A heavy pounding shook the door. "Zane," a voice called out in a thick Russian accent. "Bruno here. Open the door. Alec gone. We must secure the office." Zane and Ricky exchanged glances, weapons raised, but neither moved. The pounding continued, voices growing louder, until a volley of gunfire silenced them. The sickening thud of bodies collapsing followed, and for a moment, only silence remained. Then came a softer knock, almost casual. "It's me," said a calm voice with a Mexican accent. "Edric." Zane nodded to Ricky, who cautiously unbolted the door. Edric Canvo entered, his white shirt stained with blood, the acrid scent of gunpowder clinging to him like a second skin. He secured the door behind him, clicking each lock into place with mechanical precision. "It's done," he said, exhaling deeply and wiping sweat from his brow. "We kept our word. This empire," he looked directly at Zane, "is mine now." He advanced into the room, his presence swallowing the space. "I want your loyalty. Both of you. Alec's finished. I put 3 in his skull myself." Helen flinched. Edric's voice dripped with disdain. "Alec Suloff promised us fame, said if we moved his drugs, laundered his cash through concert tours, he'd make us stars. But he lied. He used us. While we rotted in the shadows, he lay with girls and counted money." Edric's eyes gleamed as he turned to Zane. "I'm not like him. I've kept my promises. I reunited you with your mother. Now I'll give you the spotlight you were meant for. Crimson Fireline will rise again, on my terms." Ricky stepped forward, jaw clenched. "Where are my parents?" Edric's tone flattened. "Dead. Both of them. Years ago." Silence fell like a blade. "But I kept my word to Zane," Edric added, gesturing to Helen. "I brought her here, didn't I?" "You used her," Ricky shouted. "You made her swallow drug packages like some mule." "He was about to visit your father," Edric snapped. "You think she wouldn't have told him what she saw? He would have called Alec. The whole operation would have unraveled." He turned to Helen, his tone cold. "I had no choice. If I hadn't acted, she'd be ash in the incinerator by now. She's lucky to be in this office instead." His gaze lingered, calculating. "She was stubborn, like someone else I know," he muttered, narrowing his eyes. Then he delivered the final blow. "You haven't figured it out, have you? The police have already found the jet, this morning, pulled it straight from the ocean. Ricky's face paled. What? Helen nodded slowly. It's true, I saw it. The Navy recovered it. It's all over the news. She turned to Zane, her voice barely a whisper. Your father. He knew, didn't he, about all of this? Zane sighed, rubbing his face. Yeah, he was our band manager, remember? I'll explain everything later. Edric extended his hand again. I've held up my part of the bargain. Now it's your turn. Zane looked at Helen one last time, then clasped Edric's hand. I'm sorry, Mom, he said softly, but this is the only way we can stay together and stay safe. Helen reeled as if struck. Her knees buckled, and she caught herself against the desk. It all crashed down. The years of grief, confusion, unanswered questions. She'd believed Malcolm had lost his mind, that the disappearance had broken him, but now everything made sense. His time in the metal facility wasn't madness. It was a strategy, a calculated withdrawal from scrutiny, a quiet life, concealing a monstrous truth. And now, Zane, her boy, was part of it. The men began planning aloud, body disposal, which of Alec's soldiers might be turned, which needed to disappear. They spoke of murder with the casual precision of business analysts. Helen's eyes shifted toward the desk. The phone sat within reach. Agent Donna Trude's number, etched into her mind, buzzed like a beacon. As the men spoke, Helen moved inch by inch. Her fingers closed around the receiver. Her heart pounded as she lifted it silently, dialing with shaking hands. The room froze. Edric had spotted her. His hand was already on his gun. Zane lunged. Mother, don't... Helen froze mid-dial, her breath catching as Zand yanked the receiver from her hand. The handset clattered onto the desk, the tone still humming from its speaker. What were you thinking? Zane hissed, his voice a mix of desperation and frustration. You could have gotten us all killed. She stared at him, heartbroken. And what about you, Zane? What have you become? Zane looked away. Something I never wanted to be. Edric approached slowly, holstering his weapon. She's your mother, I get it. Emotions. But this isn't some reunion fantasy. She's a liability now. We need to move her. No, Zane said firmly. She stays with me. Ricky crossed his arms. We'll lock the office down. Nobody gets in. We'll figure out what to do next. Edric hesitated, then nodded. Fine, but she tries anything else. Next time, I won't be so generous. He stormed out, the door slamming behind him. Helen collapsed into the chair, her hands shaking. The truth had shattered everything. Her family, her sense of justice, her hope for a peaceful end to a long and tragic story. And now, she sat in the belly of an empire built on fear and silence. Zane returned to her side, kneeling again. I never stopped thinking about you, I swear. Helen brushed his cheek, her fingers trembling. You're still my son. I just don't know who you are anymore. He looked down, unable to meet her eyes. I'm trying to protect you, the only way I can. She whispered, then help me get out of here. Zane didn't respond. Not yet. But Helen held on, her knuckles white, the phone pressed desperately to her ear. She heard the click as the line connected. Then Agent Trude's voice, calm, professional, unaware of the chaos erupting. FBI, Trude speaking. Edric's finger curled tighter on the trigger. Everything exploded into motion. Ricky lunged, slamming into Edric's side. The gun fired. Zane, with reflexes born of desperation, dove between the bullet and his mother. The round hit his chest with a sickening thud, spinning him around mid-air before he crumpled into Helen's arms. No, she screamed into the phone. Help us! My son's been shot! Ricky didn't hesitate. He seized the fallen weapon and fired. Once, twice, 3 times, 4, 5. Each shot struck center mass. Blood erupted from Edric's chest and head as he dropped to the floor, dead before he hit it. Ricky grabbed the phone. This is Ricky Moreno, he said, breathless but clear. I'm one of the missing members of Crimson Fire Line. We're at the warehouse. Zane Hayes is here and his mother, Helen. Zane's been shot. Edric Canvo is dead. But there are still hostiles in the building. We need backup now. Units are en route, Truitt's voice came back, sharp with urgency. Find somewhere safe. Barricade yourselves. We're coming. Ricky dropped the phone, dragging a heavy filing cabinet in front of the door as a makeshift reinforcement. On the floor, Helen cradled Zane. Blood soaked through his shirt, staining her hands, the floor, everything. She pressed her palms against the wound, futile but desperate. "Stay with me," she whispered. "Please, baby, don't you leave me now." Zane's lips moved, a whisper of breath escaping him. His eyes fluttered but didn't open. His breathing, shallow and uneven, barely kept time with the rising panic in the room. Outside, sirens roared. Not one or two, but a symphony. An army. The whir of helicopter blades joined the chorus. The warehouse erupted in gunfire as federal tactical teams breached from every angle. The siege had begun. Helen kept pressure on the wound, praying between each beat of her son's failing heart. The shouts of officers, the barks of orders, the crack of semi-automatic rifles, it all blurred into background noise. For her, the only sound that mattered was the ragged rasp of Zane's breath. Minutes or hours later, boots thundered down the corridor. "FBI Tactical," a voice shouted from the other side of the door. "Is anyone inside?" Ricky shoved the cabinet aside and yanked the door open. A team of agents in full gear flooded in. "Medic! We need a medic here now," one shouted. They descended on Zane, their training kicking in immediately. Another team scanned the room, confirming Edric was dead. One agent looked at Ricky. "Who shot him?" "I did," Ricky answered calmly. "He tried to kill us." Outside the office, the warehouse lay in ruins. Bodies strewn, evidence markers sprouting like weeds. Emergency lights bathed the night in red and blue. They wheeled Zane out on a stretcher, Helen gripping his hand as they passed through the corridors of carnage. For 19 years she'd imagined this moment, the moment she'd see her son again. But never like this. Agent Truitt arrived as they reached the ambulance. "Mrs. Hayes," she called, jogging up. "I just got here from HQ." A paramedic interrupted. "We need to move, ma'am. He's critical." "Go," Truitt told her. "I'll meet you at the hospital. I'll get Ricky's statement here." Helen looked back one last time as she climbed into the ambulance. Ricky stood among agents, bloodied and pale, but free. "We'll talk," she told him. "Soon." "I'll do the right thing," he promised. "I swear." The doors slammed shut. The ambulance sped off, sirens howling. Inside, a medic worked furiously, adjusting IVs, checking vitals, calling out orders. Helen sat silent, her hands still sticky with blood, her heart pounding too hard for her fragile condition. At the hospital, chaos reigned. Zane was rushed into surgery. Helen was led to a nearby bay, trembling. A nurse noticed her condition and intervened. "I swallowed drug packages," Helen confessed through clenched teeth. "They need to come out." The nurse's eyes widened. "Follow me." She was taken to a small treatment room. Gloves, tongs, medical tools, evidence bags. "We'll extract them carefully," the nurse explained. "If one ruptures, it could be fatal." The process was slow, excruciating, humiliating, but successful. One by one the packages were retrieved. 4 intact capsules were logged and bagged. Only after they confirmed no internal damage did they admit Helen for cardiac monitoring. EKGs, blood work, IV fluids, her failing heart strained but held. Several hours later, Agent Truitt arrived again, this time with a partner and a much softer tone. "The doctors updated us," she said. "You're stable for now. We're keeping close watch." Helen struggled to sit up. "And Zane?" Truitt paused. "He survived surgery, but he's in a coma. Flatlined twice. He's stable now, but we don't know if or when he'll wake." Helen turned her face to the wall, tears sliding silently down her cheeks. "I know it's not the reunion you hoped for," Truitt added gently, "but it's not over. He's alive. And thanks to you and Ricky, we have a mountain of evidence." Helen barely nodded. Truitt rose to leave, but turned back at the door. "Your husband," she said. "We know he was involved. We'll find him too. Helen closed her eyes. That name, Malcolm, felt like a wound. He had orchestrated so much, then disappeared into the fog of mental illness and silence. The room fell quiet again, save for the steady beep of the heart monitor. Dawn broke over the city. Ricky arrived just after sunrise under FBI escort. His eyes were hollow, his clothes the same from the night before. He carried nothing but guilt. "I gave them everything," he said. "Testimonies, names, bank records, flight manifests. I told them everything I knew." Helen nodded. "I believe you." "I didn't know what else to do," he whispered. "Zane wanted out, so did I, but by then it was too deep." She reached out, clasping his hand. "Thank you. You saved him. You saved me." They sat together in silence. No words left for what they had lost and what they had salvaged. Down the hall, Zane Hayes, voice of a band that vanished, slept in the twilight between life and death. His mother was beside him. His friend is facing justice. And the world outside, finally beginning to learn the truth. "Barry, they brought him back," the nurse whispered as she entered the room. "He's in critical condition, but stable. He lost a tremendous amount of blood." Helen let out a shaky breath and closed her eyes. "Thank God," she murmured. "He's alive." Agent Dana Truitt stepped into the hospital room shortly after, holding a manila folder in one hand, a weary expression on her face. "Ricky's been cooperative," she said gently. "He gave us the full story, or at least as much as he knows. Do you want to hear what happened back in 1981? Helen nodded slowly. "My son? He never got the chance to explain." Dana sat beside her, flipping open her notes. "According to Ricky, your husband Malcolm was more than just their band manager. He planned what was supposed to be a celebration, a private jet trip to commemorate a deal with a major international distributor. That's what he told them, but it wasn't the truth." Helen listened, heart pounding. "Once they were on board," Dana continued, "Malcolm introduced them to Alex Sulafov. That's when the true plan was revealed. The band would be part of a large-scale money laundering operation. The idea was to use their tours and merchandise sales to funnel cartel funds, drug money, under the radar. Ticket sales, T-shirt sales, even bar gigs would all become conduits." Helen clutched the edge of her blanket, feeling sick. When Zane and Trent refused, Malcolm and two armed cartel enforcers responded with force. A fight broke out. Trent was shot trying to protect Zane. Derek attempted to contact air traffic control and was executed for it, shot in the back of the head without a second thought. Tears streamed down Helen's face. "He planned it all. Malcolm planned this." "Zane was spared only because he was Malcolm's son," Dana said. "And Ricky? Ricky cooperated, but only because they threatened his family. Alex saw Ricky's popularity as a chance to grow the laundering scheme. He was the cute one, always a crowd favorite." She paused to let that sink in before continuing. "After the murders, Alec needed to get rid of the evidence. The pilot, one of Alec's men, set the jet on autopilot and ejected along with the others. They parachuted into a boat waiting off the coast. That's how they escaped detection." Helen asked, voice trembling, "Why wasn't the plane found for so long?" In 1981, radar gaps were common over the Pacific, especially that far offshore. They flew at low altitude, avoiding standard detection routes. They removed the jet's emergency beacon to prevent rescue signals. The wreckage eventually settled deep along the Juan de Fuca Ridge, nearly 12,000 feet down, far beyond the reach of the technology available at the time. Helen began to sob openly. "My baby worked for monsters. I overheard them back there. I heard them talk about him taking lives, using innocent women and children to move drugs. I don't know who he is anymore." "Alec and Edric are both dead," Dana said quietly. "And while Zane and Ricky did terrible things, they were boys, Helen. Just teenagers, manipulated by your husband and the cartel, forced into a life they never chose." "What happens now?" Helen asked, barely above a whisper. Dana looked tired. "Malcolm is finally being processed. All those years pretending to be mentally unstable won't protect him this time. We'll pursue full charges. As for Zane and Ricky, that's more complicated. Prosecutors could treat them as willing participants, but we're pushing the angle that they were coerced, trapped by threats of violence against their families. Ricky's full cooperation helps immensely. With strong legal representation, they may receive reduced sentences, possibly even immunity if they testify in court. Helen shook her head. Ricky's parents died years ago. He probably didn't even know. He was so isolated. He's at the station now, Dana said, standing, still giving his statement. If you want to see him later, we can arrange that. As the agents left, Helen pressed the call button. A nurse came quickly. I need to see my son, Helen said, her voice hoarse but resolute. The nurse nodded, gently transferring her into a wheelchair. Together, they moved slowly through the hospital's sterile hallways toward the intensive care unit. The moment they passed through the glass doors, Helen saw him. Zane lay unconscious in a hospital bed, machines surrounding him like sentinels. Tubes ran from his arms. A ventilator hissed rhythmically, bandages wrapped tightly around his chest. He looked so pale, so young. The nurse wheeled her inside and left them alone. Helen reached out with trembling fingers and brushed his hand. It was warm, but limp. "My baby," she whispered. "My sweet boy." She leaned forward, laying her head gently on his arm, letting the tears fall freely. 19 years of searching, of wondering, of aching for answers, and this was what had led to. Her son, broken, shaped by horror, by survival, by betrayal. "I'm so sorry," she cried. "I didn't know. I didn't see what your father was doing. I couldn't protect you. I failed you, and I'm so sorry." Her voice cracked, her heart threatening to break again. "But you saved me. You threw yourself in front of that bullet. After everything, you still protected me." She prayed aloud, gripping his hand tightly. "God, please, please heal my son. I know he's done things. I know he's hurt people, but you know his heart. You know he was just a boy when this all began. Please, show him mercy. Give him a second chance." She kissed his fingers softly. "I'll fight for you, Zane. I promise. Your father will answer for what he did, not you. You were a victim. You were just trying to survive." The machines continued to beep, indifferent to her pain. Zane didn't stir. His chest rose and fell in time with the ventilator. His eyelids didn't twitch. But Helen held on, believing. She remained at his side as minutes passed. Then hours. The reunion she had imagined for nearly 2 decades hadn't looked like this. But it was real, tangible, a miracle in its own right. He would wait, as long as it took, and she would be there when he opened his eyes, to hear one word, spoken just once. "Mom?"